Now that we've spent all this time learning how to factor, you might be wondering, where am I going to use this factoring at? Well, we're going to use it to help us solve quadratic equations. We'll actually have 3 methods to solve quadratic equations, but we're going to start with factoring. So in order to use factoring, we have to know this property. It tells us that if A times B, so if 2 things multiply together to be 0, one of them has to be 0. It's called the zero product property. It should be pretty intuitive. Let me show you how it works. Let's say I have 7x equals 0. If I asked you to tell me what x is, I would bet you would say x is 0, because the only way to multiply 7 by something and get 0 is if that something is 0. If I had something like negative 2.2 times y equals 0, and I asked you to tell me what y is. Again, if I'm multiplying 2 things together and they're giving me 0, that means one of them has to be 0. Well, since negative 2.2 isn't 0, that would mean y has to be 0. That's what the zero product property tells us. Oftentimes, we're going to use it for a more sophisticated problem than just 2 things multiplying together. Many times, we're going to see situations that look like this. We're going to see something where I might have x plus 3 and 2x minus 4 equals 0. And I'm going to be asked to solve something like this. Well, if I think about what it means when 2 things are written right next to each other, if 2 things are written right next to each other, it means multiply. So this means I'm multiplying x plus 3 and I'm multiplying 2x minus 4 together to get 0. Well, doesn't that mean from the zero product property that either x plus 3 has to be 0 or 2x minus 4 has to be 0? Well, these are just basic linear equations. I know how to solve these. I could subtract 3 from both sides, and for this equation I get that means x equals negative 3. From this equation I would add 4 and then divide by 2, getting x equals 2 for my 2 solutions. Well, how am I going to use this to help me solve a quadratic equation? Say, for example, x squared minus 5x plus 6. Well, if once I change it to multiplication, I can make an assumption that one of the terms has to be 0. And if I think about when we learned how to factor, we said our ultimate goal was always to change it to multiplication. If I factor this, I'll have a multiplication problem. So I go through my list of factoring. I see there is no GCF. I see it's not a binomial. I see it is a trinomial, and it does start with x squared. So I'm going to go ahead and put an x in the front of 2 sets of parentheses, and I'm going to do factors of 6 with a sum of negative 5, because I have to remember that the sign belongs to the number. So if I try negative 2 times negative 3, I see I get 6. And negative 2 plus negative 3 does give me negative 5. So I'm going to go ahead and plug those in. So prior to now, I would have been done at this point. This would have been all I could do. But now we're going to take it a step further, because before we only had expressions. Now we have equations. So since my equation was equal to 0 here, I still have to be equal to 0 after I factored it. So I'm going to squeak it in here, and then I'm just going to go ahead and rewrite this problem down here. Meaning I have x minus 2 times x minus 3 equals 0. Now I'm trying to solve for x, so I want to know what is x. What does x equal? Well, from here, because I've now factored, I've now got my multiplication. I have x minus 2 times x minus 3. That means either x minus 2 has to equal 0 or x minus 3 has to equal 0. Well, if x minus 2 equals 0, I could add 2 to each side and I get x equals 2. If x minus 3 equals 0, I can add 3 to each side and I get x equals 3. These would be the solutions to my given equation up above. These are the 2 numbers that if either of those were plugged in to this equation, they would both make the equation true. They would both make the equation equal to 0. And you can go ahead and plug those in and check them if you'd like. Looking at 2 more official examples. So I have example 1 here and example 2. If you want to follow along with example 1, and then we'll maybe try example 2 before I go over it. So on example 1, if I want to solve this, so I see it is quadratic, so I'm hoping that to solve it, I want to get it, I'm hoping that to solve it, I can factor. Well, in order to use the zero product property, one thing I need to point out is it has to be equal to 0. I notice this equation is not equal to 0. So the very first thing I'm going to do is get my equation equal to 0. So in order to do that, I'm going to subtract 18 from both sides. And my new equation will be x squared plus 7x minus 18 equals 0. I see them in standard form, so I'm good to go. First thing I check for is GCF. There is nothing that all three of these terms can be divided by. I do not have a binomial. I do have a trinomial, and I have a coefficient of x. So I know that this is going to be factoring to be x and x. It will still be equal to 0 after I factor it. I'm going to do a little bit of work over here. I'm going to do factors of negative 18, sign belongs to the number, with a sum of 7. And so I'm going to try 9 times negative 2. That does give me negative 18, and 9 and plus a negative 2 does give me 7. So I get what I want. So I'm going to go ahead and put plus 9 in here and minus 2 in here. From here, I'm going to notice that I now have multiplication. I have x plus 9 times x minus 2. If two things multiply to be 0, one of them has to be 0. So that means either x plus 9 has to equal 0 or x minus 2 has to equal 0. Solving my first equation by subtracting 9, I get x equals negative 9. Solving my second equation by adding 2, I get x equals 2. And those are my two solutions. Looking at example 2, this would be a good one if you want to try to stop the video and try it on your own before I go over it. Okay, now that you've had a chance to try one, first thing I'm going to notice is I do not have it equal to 0. Remember, I have to get the equation equal to 0 first. So I don't like working with a negative on my quadratic term. So I'm going to go ahead and subtract 6 and add 4x. Not a big deal. I could do it the other way, but I just don't like having a negative quadratic term. So I'll subtract 6. I'll add 4x to both sides. When I do, I'm going to remember it doesn't matter what order you add and subtract in, so I'm going to put it in standard form. So I'm going to add 4x on the left and then subtract 6. Giving me 2x squared plus 4x minus 6 equals 0. It's quadratic. I'm going to try to solve it by factoring it. So I look for a GCF. I see they can all be divided by 2. I'm going to take that out, and I get x squared plus 2x minus 3 equals 0. From here, I realize that inside of my parentheses, I'm left with a trinomial that starts with x squared. So I'm going to go ahead and try to factor this further. By doing factors, I'm gonna run out of room, so I'm just going to use an F to stand for factors. Factors of negative 3 with a sum of 2. So I would try probably 3 times negative 1. I know that multiplies to give me negative 3. 3 plus negative 1 I know adds to give me 2. So it looks like that works. So I have plus 3, I have minus 1. I'm still equal to 0. From here I have 1, 2, 3 things that are multiplying together to be 0. So if I want, I can set each one equal to 0. Now, it's silly to say 2 equals 0. That's never going to happen. That's a false statement. I don't have to worry about solving that. However, this one, x plus 3 equals 0, I can subtract 3, giving me x equals negative 3 for one of my solutions, and I can add 1, giving me x equals 1 for my other solution.